Hey everyone! Today we are going to be sewing up the Iris Mini Crossbody from A Quaint Stitch. This is a really cute little crossbody pattern. It has a flap closure that can be done with either a magnetic snap or a turn lock. It has an adjustable and removable crossbody strap that can be secured with either riveted D-ring attachments or sewn in D-ring attachments. And on the inside, it's got a quite roomy main compartment and also an interior zipper pocket. It is a boxed bottom bag, and we will be able to demonstrate how the better boxed bottom method works on a pattern that is not one of my own patterns. And we will also be able to practice sewing and top stitching curves for the curved flap, and we'll also have many opportunities to practice our top stitching. For this tutorial, it's assumed that you've already cut and interfaced your entire pattern per the instructions. But I will give you a couple of tips for cutting out this pattern. I did block interfacing for my lining pieces, which means that I fused all of my interfacing to the back of my uncut cotton woven fabric and then cut it out. And I actually, for this pattern, used the SVG files on my Cricut, and the files were perfect. I didn't have to make any adjustments to them. Some of the file pieces that you need duplicates of, such as this bottom section, you will need to duplicate that image for your cut file so that you can make sure that you have the right number of pieces cut out. But it all worked really well. I even cut my Decaville on the Cricut. I used my rotary blade and it worked out perfectly. So this was really quick to cut out and it's ready for me to sew together for you. So we have our lining pieces and our zipper pocket lining. We have our exterior pieces in vinyl. We have Decaville light stabilizer. And for my strap, I am going to show you how to sew up a two-tone strap. So let's get going. The first thing that we're going to do is prepare our D-ring connectors. If you are doing the riveted D-ring connectors, then you will have the long pieces with the rounded ends. I am going to show you the sewn-in version of the D-ring connectors. So I have my piece cut here per the measurements in the instructions, and it is two D-ring connectors that are at the moment joined together. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a piece of Decaville in the center of that connector piece just to reinforce it so that when it has weight on it from the bag, it is not going to tear. Just lay that piece of Decaville down the center there, and I'm just going to fuse that in place. The Decaville is fused down the midline of the D-ring connector piece, and I'm going to take my double-sided tape and just put a strip directly over the line that we drew earlier. Peel the backing off and then fold the long raw edges into the center. I like to start at the middle and work my way out so that I don't get any twists in my folded vinyl. My Decaville scrap is cut to just slightly narrower than the finished D-ring connector width. So I'm using 3/4 of an inch connectors. So my Decaville strip is the length of the connector piece by just under 3/4 of an inch so that my connector vinyl can fold around that Decaville. What I'm now going to go and do is sew around the edge of this connector piece, and in the center point I'm going to backstitch, even though I'm going to continue sewing because then I can cut that in the middle without worrying that that's going to come undone. So I'm just going to put a little mark in the center, and that is where it'll be cut into two separate connector pieces. So that is top stitched, and now I'm just going to cut down the center there, and I'm just going to be cutting between these backstitched areas there in the middle to divide it into two separate D-ring connectors, and then trim. You can choose to use D-rings or O-rings. For this particular one, I'm going to use O-rings. Sometimes I prefer O-rings because when the ring is on the bag, if it turns, it's going to look the same, whereas sometimes these D-rings flip around in the bag and are not sitting with the flat side down anymore, and with the O-ring, you avoid that. With that O-ring slid on there, what I'm now going to do is just place a rivet just below where that O-ring is to keep that O-ring in place. You can also sew across the strap tab below the level of your O or D ring, making sure when you do that you hold your tails so that you don't get nesting, and you may also need to increase your tension so that you don't get any bunching or extra thread on the back of your connector. You want to make sure that you're placing your rivet far enough up the connector piece that it is not going to get caught in your stitches when you sew in your strap tab. With those D or O rings riveted or sewn to the top of your connectors, we're just going to set that aside and grab our strap pieces. If you are sewing a strap that is just one piece of material, whether that's vinyl or fabric, then you can just sew that as you normally would. And I do have videos on sewing a strap that is not a two-tone strap that I will link for you. But I am going to show you how to sew a two-tone strap. So I am doing a 3/4 of an inch wide strap for my Iris today. So I have a vinyl piece that is cut at 1.5 inches wide, and I have a fabric piece that will be the other side of the two-tone strap that is cut at 1.25 of an inch wide. So you want your vinyl piece to be double the final width of your strap, and you want your fabric piece to be double the final width of your strap minus 1/4 of an inch. So for a 1 inch wide strap, you would have a 2-inch vinyl piece and a 1 3/4 inch fabric piece. For the 3/4 inch wide strap, you have 1.5 inches and 1.25 inches. I'm going to set the fabric piece aside for the moment and take the vinyl piece. And what I'm going to do is just draw a line straight down the middle like we would with any of our other strap options. If I was doing a vinyl only strap, I would also reinforce my strap with a piece of ribbon or some interfacing or stabilizer. But because I'm using woven on the back, this will create my stabilizer, so I don't need to add another layer. So just drawing a line straight down the middle. I'm also going to draw a line straight down the middle of the fabric section. So because this piece is 1.25 inch wide, I'm drawing my line at 5/8 of an inch. I'm then going to take my double-sided tape, and I am using 3/8 of an inch wide double-sided tape, and I'm going to put it straight down the middle. Because we're going to be folding the raw edges in and then sandwiching the two sides of the strap together, we won't be sewing in this middle section, so it's fine to put your tape there. Making sure that when you put the tape on, that your fabric and your vinyl stay nice and smooth so that you don't get any waves in your finished strap. Repeat for the vinyl side also. What we're now going to do is we're just going to taper the end in slightly here, because when we place this end on, we will fold it around to hide the raw edge, but this will be slightly wider. So we're just going to take a slight taper at the end of this strap piece of about 1/2 inch by 1/8 of an inch. Just a little tiny taper at both ends of the vinyl strap. What we're then going to do is go to the center of the strap. We're going to remove the backing from the double-sided tape, and we are going to fold the long edge into the center line that we drew all the way along the strap, taking care not to twist the vinyl as we're going, making sure when we fold the vinyl, we're folding it straight across directly into the center, that you don't get any skews or twisting in your finished strap. And when you get to the tapered part, just lining the tapered edge up with the center line so that you can see the strap here just tapers in slightly. I'm then going to take my seam roller and I'm just going to press those folds. Set that aside and repeat the process on the fabric side. But this side we don't need to taper at the end because it is the narrower of the two. But again, working from the middle out. And once you've finished folding your fabric side to the center, you can either seam roll that again, or you can use your iron just to press that down. And then we will lay it onto the vinyl side so that it can be sewn together. Take both of your strap pieces and we want to lay them so that the fabric strap is about an inch longer at each end compared to your vinyl strap, because we're going to fold the raw end over and then over again to enclose the raw end of the vinyl strap like this. So you can lay them side by side full length and then trim the vinyl strap if you need to. Mine is already shorter, so I'm just going to trim this so that it's about an inch longer on either end. And then I'm going to lay the fabric strap on the table, and I'm going to put double-sided tape down the middle of the vinyl strap. What we're now going to do is lay the fabric strap on top of that vinyl strap. And you want to do your best to center it up, and there should just be a slight gap on either side of the fabric where you see the vinyl. I like to start in the middle again, so I'm just going to fold that in half, and I'm not going to mark it with anything. Actually, my middle is right where that seam is there, where I've joined two small pieces of vinyl together, so that will work well. And on this one, it's right here. I'm just going to pop a clip. And then starting from the center and working my way out, I'm going to press the fabric side onto the vinyl with the seams together in the middle, so wrong sides together. Just putting that in the center of the vinyl strap. And then I'm just going to press it down, keeping it as flat and smooth as I can. And you should have a little bit of overhang at that end. Continue back to the other end. And you can see that where we've tapered it at the end here, that will be completely covered by that fabric when we fold it over. And we will fold the raw end in and then fold that over again to enclose the raw end of that vinyl, so you have no edges showing on your strap. I'm going to grab a little bit of double-sided tape and just put that on that fold there to keep that in place. And the same on the other end. What I'm now going to do is sew around this entire strap. I'm going to be sewing with the vinyl side up. I need to make sure that I'm taking a great enough seam allowance that I am catching the fabric side, and I'm going to be using the edge of my strap lined up with part of my presser foot with a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And if you have a look with your ruler, that will be on the fabric part, and that will sew this fabric layer to the vinyl layer, and it will go around the entire strap. When I get to the end, I'm going to sew onto the tab that we folded over and around. But what you can do if your machine is going to struggle with that bulk is just peel open the fold that we made, keeping the double-sided tape out of the way, and sew down and around and back up, and then fold it back over. And when you go to secure your strap, you will either sew through or rivet through that tab, so you don't actually have to sew that down right now if you don't want to. Using my walking foot, I'm increasing my tension. I am not going to backstitch, but I will take long tails that I will pull through and tie off when I am done. I also have my hump jumper here for coming up over these bulky areas. If you're not happy with where your needle hits at the end there, you can turn your hand wheel back, and that will raise that needle up out of that last stitch, and then lower it back down where you want it to hit. Just hand cranking along the edge, and then I will turn it again and continue down the other side. Take care, if you're using a walking foot, that the end of your strap is not getting caught on the walking foot where it pulls the fabric through at the back. If you're not using a walking foot, I recommend finishing off your line of stitches at one end and then taking your strap back to where you started and sewing back down the same direction, and that will help to reduce your twists. But really, if you're sewing a lot of straps like this, a walking foot is a great investment. When you come back up to where you started, you can pull your threads through to one side. And then sew up to where your first stitch is. You can manually position that needle to hit back in the same spot. Pull the needle all the way up to complete the stitch, and then pull it off the machine. And then pull all the threads through to the back. And when you have 4 threads at the back, tie them off, and then we will use a hand sewing needle to tuck them back between the 2 layers. When you've tied a secure knot, grab your needle. We're just going to tuck it between the layers, so it comes out here at the side, and then pull those threads through as a bundle, and then you can just trim that within the gap. With the strap sewn, we now need to attach our hardware. I always start with the slider end. I find that way to be the easier way to do it. I'm going to slide my slider on, tuck that end through, and then what we're going to do is either sew or rivet that in place. I'm going to rivet mine. You can use 1 or 2 rivets. I'm just going to use 1 today. It's going to place it in the middle. Because we've got a fair bit of bulk there, I'm going to be using a longer rivet. Just punch my hole through all the layers, making sure that it's centered up. You can mark it if you like, and check that I'm happy with the placement on the back, and that looks fine. So I'm going to pop a long stem rivet in there, and I'm going to rivet that before I put the swivel hooks on. I've got rivets here with a 10mm post. Depending on your material thickness, you may need a 12mm post. You just want to make sure that you can see enough of that poking through, and that when you click your cap on, you feel it click into place. And then when you go and press it down, you want to feel 2 clicks so that you know that it has set properly. So I'm going to go and set that rivet, and then we'll put on the swivels. That is set. So we're going to take one swivel, slide that on, and that one is just going to be the loose one. Take the other end of your strap, making sure that there's no twists anywhere. Fold it back over and up through the slider. Slide the other end through. So you can see you have this swivel in place here, and the fold is enclosed in the middle of that loop. And then we take our second slider, slide that on, fold that over, and again it's folded to the back, and you can place 1 or 2 rivets there, whatever your preference is. I like to place mine in the middle of the strap and the middle of the folded over piece of fabric. And then another longer post rivet, press it on. You can also use your key fob pliers to squeeze that down a bit. And then I will go and set that rivet also. With that strap complete and our completed connector tabs, we can move on to the interior zipper pocket. Set those aside and take one of your pocket lining pieces with interfacing applied and your zipper pocket piece. The method for putting in the zipper pocket in the Iris Crossbody pattern instructions is different to the way that I've done it in other videos. We're going to do it the way that the instructions are done. If you prefer to do it the way that I've demonstrated in my interior zipper pocket for any bag video, you are more than welcome to do it that way. We will also be birthing the bag through the open lining and then closing the lining up through the zipper pocket. So keep that in mind when you are sewing on your zipper pocket. Alternatively, you can birth through the lining and then just close it up without going through the zipper pocket. So take your pocket piece, and we are just going to fold it in half, short end to short end, and make a center crease. Then you're going to take your ruler and you're just going to measure 1/2 inch down from that center line. And we're just going to draw a line there. Then 3/8 of an inch below that line, you're going to draw a second line. So you have your center crease here, a line 1/2 inch below that center crease, and then a second line 3/8 of an inch below that. And then we're going to make this into a rectangle that is 6 inches wide. So you're going to draw a line 1 inch from either end. And then you're also going to draw a line down the center. And then you're going to angle towards the corners. Take your lining piece, and you want to have the pocket opening that we just drew about 1.25 inches down from the upper edge of your pocket and in the center. You can use a ruler to measure that, and then I just like to use a little bit of painter's tape just to keep that in place. You can also put a couple of clips in the corners here just to keep that pocket lining in place. And then we will go and sew around this rectangle. Using a shorter stitch length, I'm going to be sewing directly on this line here. When I come up to the corner, I'm going to keep the needle down, making sure that it's hit directly at the corner, hand cranking if I need to make sure it's hitting right. Then pivot, sew along this end, hit right in the corner, pivot, and around until I complete my rectangle. Check my placement. That needle's hit in that corner, come straight down. And then I will go past where I started and backstitch to secure those threads. This pocket lining piece is now sewn to the interior of the bag. We'll remove the tape and my clips, and now I'm going to open up this zipper opening. Put your threads through. You can snip those. You can tie them. I back stitched pretty well there, so I'm just going to snip those off. I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to cut on this line in the center. If you're concerned about cutting too far, you can put some pins right at the end here. If you slide a pin into your material, like so, when you cut it with your rotary cutter, you'll have a stop point there. You won't be able to cut through those stitches at the end. I'm just going to cut from this point of that triangle to this point here, down the middle of that rectangle. Then take a sharp pair of scissors. Make sure when you're doing that your pocket lining is flat. You don't want to accidentally have it tucked under and cut through it and have to start over. Take your scissors, snip to that point, and then you're going to snip up to this corner. You want to get as close to that corner as you can without cutting any of your threads. It doesn't matter too much if your cut here is not directly in the middle. And you can see that that's cut up nice and close to those corners without cutting through. If you do accidentally cut through, then what you would do is go and sew your box again slightly bigger around the original rectangle so that you have a rectangle that has no cuts in it. Now what we need to do is fold this pocket lining through. So just fold it around. Through that opening that we just made, and now we need to press it to the rectangle shape. I like to roll the long side of the rectangle with my fingers to roll that seam out, and then I will press it with a seam roller. You can also press it with an iron. You can also do slip pockets like this. This is a welt style slip pocket. So you would sew it the same way as we're doing now. And then instead of installing your zipper, you would just sew around this rectangle. And then when it's all said and done, you would just close up your pocket like so. Press that all the way around and check at the corners to see if you have any puckering. If you have puckering here at the corner, it's likely because your snips are not close enough to the corner. So you can come back around and take little tiny snips. You can even fold the pocket back through and do your snips that way. But if you have come nice and close to your stitch line, then you should have a nice flat pocket there. I'm going to go and press that with my iron also so we can see how it's sitting. Once you're happy with how your pocket opening looks, grab your zipper and some double-sided tape. Turn your lining piece over and you're going to put a strip of double-sided tape along the bottom and the top of that pocket opening. Then take your zipper, place it on your cutting mat, Remove the backing from the double-sided tape. And you want to center that up on your zipper. My zipper is wider than my pocket piece, but I'm going to keep it as the full length so that I don't have any raw ends that may fray inside my pocket. If you are using a zipper that will have the ends within your pocket opening, you will want to put some fray check on the end or melt the end so that that zipper doesn't fray, or like this one is cut with pinking shears. So center that up, and centering the zipper also in the middle of that box, height-wise. Press it down with the double-sided tape. And then I like to check that I'm not going to hit the stop if you have a zipper with a stop on it on either side. And then we're going to sew around this box. Now, at the moment, my zipper pull is here. I am going to have to slide it into the middle. That's not something that we want to forget, but I am going to sew partway around my box first before I slide that pull. This side of the zipper will also be exposed within your pocket. If you prefer the other zipper installation method that uses a facing so that you don't have that, I will link the video for that. And I will also link the video for adding an overlay to your pocket if you find that you struggle with getting a nice rectangle opening. So you can head over to the machine and sew this zipper in. Starting on the bottom, I'm going to be using a stitch length that is halfway between a top stitching stitch length and what I like to use for construction, as we are sewing the zipper in place. So I like to use something a little shorter than a typical top stitching stitch length, but also not quite so short as I use for construction. I'm not going to be back stitching. I'm going to take long tails and then I will pull my threads through to the back when I'm done. Sewing straight along the bottom. Something else to consider is what material you use for your pocket lining. Where you fold it under, you can just see a little bit of that material there. But because it is the same print as I've used for my lining, it's not particularly obvious. If you have a very light or a very dark print, then that fold there will be more noticeable. So that's just something to consider when you are picking which material to use. You want to have something that blends in with either your zipper tape or with your lining fabric. When you get to the corner, you want to pivot with the needle down. And if you need to, just go back there. It just skipped that stitch. If you do find when you're done that you have a skipped stitch at your corner, I do have a quick fix video on that I will link as well. Continuing straight along. And when we get close to the other end here where that zipper pull is, I'm just going to slide it back past where I've already sewn. The reason being that I will get a more even stitch line around the pocket opening if I'm not going past that zipper pull. But my zipper is now open here, so I'm just going to put those teeth a little closer together. If you've used zipper by the yard, then you can keep your zipper closed at that end of the pocket also. Turn. Make sure that it hasn't skipped that stitch. If it has, raise your needle. Slide the material back. Drop the needle again. Make sure that it catches that bobbin thread. Keep going. Turn again. And continue along the bottom, meeting back up with where we started. You can hand crank to get that needle to hit in the same spot. If it's not quite lined up, that's pretty good. Raise the needle, pull it off, and you're going to take all your threads through to the back. pull slightly on the bobbin thread and that will pull a loop through, which you then can pull through. Make sure that you're getting the right threads. Check on the front that you don't have any missed stitches from pulling the threads through, and that lines up well. Take your 4 threads, and I will knot those 4 all together, and then I will take a needle and I will tuck it between the layers here. I'll tuck it through that stitch line, and then the bundle of threads will come out underneath here, and then I can snip it. I do a square knot. So first I tie with the right hand thread over the top, and then the left hand thread, which is the thread that was originally on the right hand side because it switches sides, to make a double knot like that. Then that's nice and secure, it won't slip. Then I take a needle, preferably one with a large eye, and then making sure that I'm not going into the main part of my bag lining. I'm just going to take that with the point of the needle through the stitch line, check where it's coming out on the back to make sure it's not going into the pocket or through the bag lining. Take my 4 threads that are knotted together securely, put them through the eye of the needle, pull it through the back, and then I can trim that. I don't trim it too short. I leave about 3/8 of an inch because it's hidden inside the bag. If it's too short, then the bundle can just come right out of the hole you just poked it through. And there you have that all tucked in with no back stitching, same from the front. And what we're now going to do is sew the sides closed. You can use clips to hold that in place, or you can just fold it. You want your ends here to line up, and we're just going to sew straight down this side. I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and the end, going back to my shorter construction stitch length and sewing at 3/8 of an inch from the edge of that pocket. We are not sewing the bottom of the pocket closed because we will be using that to close up our lining. And then doing the other side, making sure that it's lined up. Taking care of where any bits of the zipper may be. The stops are right here, so I'm not going to hit those. Back stitch and then trim those threads. With the sides sewn up, we can just trim those threads, and you can also just press this top fold of your pocket if it's not quite flat, and that will just help the lining to sit nicely inside of your bag. You can also trim the excess parts of your zipper if you like. If you do trim that, then just make sure that you secure those with a lighter or something just so that it doesn't fray. And then we can set the lining aside and move on to sewing up the flap. Take your lining flat piece and a ruler, and working from the back, you're going to mark a point that is in the center and 1 1/4 inches up from the bottom edge. Take your washer and lay that so that the dot is in the middle of the circle, and mark the 2 lines and copy the same 2 lines onto a scrap of stabilizer or vinyl just to reinforce the snap. We now need to cut the slits. I like to do that with my seam ripper. One of the smaller ones works well for this. I'm just going to poke it in the bottom of that line and then poke it out the top. And then once it's through, I can cut up with the seam ripper, and I know I'm not going to cut too far. If you don't poke the point of your seam ripper out the top, then you run the risk of sliding your seam ripper too far and cutting too big of a hole there. We're also going to cut the same slits in the stabilizer piece. Then flip it over. Take your stud portion of your magnetic snap, put it through the holes, grab some fray check, and I just like to put a couple of little grips of fray check where I've cut that. If you're using non-fray material like vinyl, then you don't need to do that. Put your stabilizer over the top, then your washer. I like to fold the prongs out rather than in so that there's less bulk. And then I take a small piece of duct tape to protect the material and keep that snap secure. That over the top. And I use my seam roller just to really get that duct tape to adhere to the material. And then you have the stud portion of your snap installed. Now we can sew our flap. Take the exterior part of your flap and you're going to put it face down with the lining piece. We're going to place some clips around the edge. I'm not going to place clips around the curve yet because we are going to mark that curve to make sure that we're getting nice symmetrical curve on both sides. What we're now going to do is mark our sewing lines for this curve so that we can make sure that we're getting a very even curve on both sides and a nice flat bottom to our flat piece. We're going to work from the vinyl side because we'll be sewing with the lining side down as it's the thinner of the materials and it will stay better lined up if we sew with the lining side down as opposed to the vinyl side. So you're going to grab a pen and the first thing that we're going to do is mark the seam allowance along this bottom part of the flap and part way up the side. This pattern uses a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance unless otherwise noted. Let's take that clip out temporarily. So now we need to mark our curve so that we can get a nice even curve. Now you may have something that works well for placing at your corner to get a nice even line that you can just copy to both sides. But if you don't have something, what you're going to want to do is take your ruler and you're just going to measure in a couple of points, 3/8 of an inch from that curve. And then you're just going to draw in the curve shape. The main thing that you want is to have this side and this side match. You want them to be symmetrical, and that's how you're going to get a really nice looking curve on your flap. Because the flap is a feature of this bag being right at the front, you want to make sure that it looks as good as it can. So nice straight line here to sew along, and then sketch around your curve so that when you sew, it'll be as even as possible. And we'll also use a presser foot to guide us as we go around that curve to make sure it's nice and even. But if you have something that matches up pretty well with that curve, you can also just trace around the shape of that to get it to be nice and even. A couple of other little marks I like to make before I start sewing around the flap is the seam allowance at the starting point here, and that will help me line up my needle and the edge of my presser foot so I get a very even seam allowance all the way around. And because we have this point here, we want to make sure that that's even on both sides. So I'm going to take my ruler and coming straight in from that corner with this edge lined up on my cutting mat and my ruler there, I'm drawing a line 90 degrees straight from that point here, 90 degrees here, and then I'm just going to put a mark at the seam allowance so that I know that I want my needle to hit here, and then I will pivot to continue down this side. And I'm going to do the same on the other side. And then I will go and sew around the flap, back stitching at the beginning and the end, sewing all the way around. We're leaving this part open for the moment. That's how we'll turn the flap out. Back stitching at the beginning. I have my presser foot lined up with the edge of the fabric, and the needle is at 3/8 of an inch, so that I know if I keep the edge of my presser foot lined up with the edge of the material all the way around, I will have a nice even seam allowance, which will give me a perfect flap. Sewing up to that point, making sure the needle hits right where we put that mark, pivoting with the needle down, and then continue straight down this side. As we go around the curve, it's a little harder to use the edge of your presser foot as a guide, so that's why we have that curve drawn on. And if we just sew on that line, we know that when we're done, we will have a nice even curve on both sides. I like to sew 2 stitches at a time, then raise the presser foot slightly and pivot the project so that I get a nice smooth curve, and then continue straight along the bottom, coming up to the second curve, and then again I sew 2 stitches, raise the presser foot just slightly, pivot the material, 2 stitches, and again, and I continue that all the way around so that I get a nice even curve that'll be the same on both sides. And then continue straight up the side. When I get to that mark, pivot again, and continue along the angled side, back stitch at the top on the other side. We've sewn around our flap, and before we go any further, just make sure that you're happy with how that looks. And then we are going to clip these corners where it curves so that we get a nice smooth curve once we turn it out. We're also going to clip here where this side of the flap pivots, and that will help it to sit nice and smooth once we turn it out. You can use pinking shears, or you can just take little snips. For this corner, I'm going to cut a little triangle. You don't want to get too close to your stitch line. This is about 1/8 of an inch away. And that will just help when this turns under. These pieces are going to fold in like this, and that will just help that to sit nice and flat. If you don't do the trim, there's going to be a little buckle there. And the same is true here. So just taking some small snips just around that curve. And now we're going to turn this out. Take your thumb and just push that curve out. Roll the seam. And if you have a point turner, you can use that also on that curve. I have one like this. And just use that, just press the curved end into that curve of the flap and roll that out. And then you can press from the cotton side with an iron from either side using a seam roller. Just going to press that out, making sure that our curves are as smooth as we can get them. If you're having trouble getting your curves to sit flat, you might need to do a few more little snips around your curve. Just roll it out, and again, use your turner to get it nice and smooth. And when you're happy with that, you can insert your stabilizer. If you're using Decaville as your stabilizer, you can fuse it before you sew the flap or afterwards. If you're using foam, you can pop that in. I'm going to get my seams pressed nice and flat, and then I'm going to insert my deckerville. That's all pressed. You just want to make sure too that at your seams, at the edge, you can't see the lining from the front. So just roll that as needed, and we'll keep it in place when we top stitch. I've got my stabilizer. I'm just going to pop that inside. I've got the fusible side down on the cotton woven side. Just going to tuck that into place, and I'm making sure that the seam allowance is on the lining side of the deckerville. Even though I'm going to fuse it from this side, that just keeps that bulk out of the front of the flap. If you're using fusible, you can fuse that in place. If you are fusing your stabilizer after you've sewn your flap, just make sure that you don't heat your magnetic snap, as that can put a scald in your vinyl. So you want to make sure you fuse from here up and then just the sides around that magnetic snap. And then we can go ahead and top stitch around the flap, and we will also be closing up this opening at the top. I'm going to start and stop my top stitching in this top part of the flap there so that I can back stitch. I'm going to use a longer stitch length. I will increase my tension slightly, and I'm going to use the inside of my presser foot here as a guide with my needle in the far left position so that I get a nice even top stitch as I go around. And when we get to the curve, I'm going to top stitch that with the same method as we used to sew around the curve when we were putting the flap together, sewing 2 stitches at a time and then pivoting so that I get a nice even curve. I'm going to go slow as I come to where the flap pivots. Turn the material slightly with the presser foot up and then sew down the straight side. Come up to the curve, 2 stitches at a time. And checking your tension is important for going around the curve. Sometimes you need to increase your tension more for sewing the curves to get your thread to be nice and even on the top and the bottom. I also recommend doing your top stitching with the exterior facing up, as that is the part that you will see, so you'll know if you're happy with how it looks. So pivoting when you notice that the curve is starting to move away from the edge of that presser foot. But again, at that point, come up to the top and sew back along to meet up with where we started, where I will go past the start point and backstitch. Take a look. If you notice that you're not happy with the tension on your corners, if there is some loose threads there on the bottom, you can use a needle, use the blunt end of a needle to pull up the slack, and then that will help to keep those stitches nice and tight around that corner. So trim those threads. They will be hidden in the back seam allowance. And then we can move on to constructing the exterior. We're now going to be sewing together the front panel. We're going to start with the centerpiece and the 2 side pieces. You want to make sure that your centerpiece is positioned so that it is slightly wider than it is tall. And then you're going to place your flaps right sides together, put them in place, and then they're just going to be sewn with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You can draw in that seam allowance if you wish. I'm going to just use the edge of my presser foot with the needle positioned at the right seam allowance. It's just a straight line there, so you're just sewing from one end straight down to the other. I'm going to go and sew down here and down here at 3/8 of an inch. Those 2 side panels are sewn in place with back stitching at the beginning and the end. I'm going to trim my threads, and then we're going to fold that open and top stitch. When you're top stitching, you can choose to top stitch on just the outside panel, just the inside panel with it folded under like that. Or you can open your seam allowance right out and sew down both sides. If you're sewing on a domestic machine that struggles a little bit with the layers, folding the seam allowance open like so will help to reduce bulk in your top seam. If you're going to top stitch your seam allowance to one side or the other, I recommend putting a little snip here after you've done your top stitching to also just reduce that bulk. I'm going to go and top stitch here now. I'm going to sew just the outside panel. I'm going to start my top stitching on the center panel so that I can backstitch here. I cannot backstitch on this side because I'm going to snip that corner to reduce the bulk. So I'm going to start sewing here, come along, sew down the edge, and then backstitch here at the bottom. And do that on both sides. To keep that flap folded out, you can use your seam roller to press that, or you can put some double-sided tape at the very edge, and then you can use that to press that down. And you won't be sewing through that tape because you're going to sew at 1/8 of an inch, and this is a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, so you have a good clearance there. So top stitching down this side and this side at 1/8 of an inch, or if you wish, fold the seam allowance open and sew both sides, or fold the seam allowance in and sew the inside panel. My top stitching is done. I'm going to snip my threads, and then I'm going to turn it over. I'm just going to cut just the very corner there, and that'll help keep the bulk to a minimum. I'm now going to join the bottom section to that top section, and this piece should be pretty close in width to this bottom panel if we have been accurate with our seam allowances. We're going to line that up at the edges, put the two pieces together, and then we will attach this bottom section again at 3/8 of an inch, and then we will fold it open and top stitch along that bottom seam. Back stitching at the beginning and at the end. And then fold down that bottom section, and you can use double-sided tape or a seam roller if you would like to keep that nice and flat. I'm going to start my back stitching in the side seam here so that that's hidden on the front of the bag, using a longer stitch length, and then sewing straight down this side here. Turn and back stitch again in the side seam at the other end. We're going to set this front exterior piece aside for now, and we're going to sew together our back exterior piece, and then we will fuse the stabilizer onto both or sew that in place at the same time. So take your other exterior pieces. You will have your bottom, middle, and top section, and you will also need your completed flap. The first thing we're going to do is attach the center section to the bottom section. So the same way as we attached this bottom section to the center section, we're just going to line up the edges, clip it in place, and then sew that with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Sewing just straight across, and then we will fold it open and top stitch. If you're concerned about getting your pieces centered up, you can mark the centers on each section either by folding and clipping, like so, or you can make a mark in the center so that you can be certain that when you are joining together your pieces, they are perfectly lined up. Back stitching at the beginning and at the end, sewing straight down the edge using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're also going to top stitch this seam. When you're folding that seam, you can choose if you want to fold it just to one side, like I did for this one. But if you're concerned about the bulk, you can fold that bottom seam completely open. It is possible to do that on this seam as well, especially if you have folded these seams open. And you would just fold that all out and smooth it down and sew it in place so that you don't have as much bulk if you're worried about how your machine is going to cope with these seams on the side. I'm going to use my double-sided tape to fold that down. And then same as we did for the front panel, we're going to top stitch along here, or if you have folded your seam open, you can top stitch along both sides. At the side here, if you are planning to clip this seam allowance, you can choose to start and end your top stitching on the upper side of that stitch line, or you can back stitch within the same line. I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So in this one, I'm going to demonstrate back stitching above the fold, still at 1/8 of an inch, back stitching in the side seam there, cross over the fold, turn your project, and then you continue straight down the lower side of that join. Turn it again, and back stitch back above the fold on this side, so that when we go to join our side seams, we can clip this corner here to reduce the bulk without cutting through our back stitching. We now need to place our flap. So we're going to mark the center of this middle section and the center of our flap. And then we're going to place it so that the exterior of the flap is face down with the exterior back of the bag. Line up those marks. And the first thing I'm going to do is just baste this flap in place so that I can make sure it's perfectly lined up on my exterior. You can also check your measurements on either side to make sure that they're even. You can use double-sided tape to keep that in place as well. I'm just going to put some clips in, and then I'm just going to baste that at 1/8 of an inch straight along this edge. We're now going to take the uppermost exterior back piece, and with the longer side down, lining up those centers, we're going to sandwich the flap with the wrong side of the flap facing up on the exterior uppermost section. We're going to clip all the way along, and then we're going to go over to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew through all of these layers. So we're going to be sewing through the exterior middle, the flap, and the exterior top. So you're going to want to check your tension, and if you have a hump jumper, keep it handy for these bumps here as we come up over the bulk of that flap and back down the other side. Again, sewing at 3/8 of an inch and taking care as we get to this bump. Back stitch, and as you come up to the flap, just take your time, making sure you don't miss any stitches. And I like to just hold the uppermost piece here as we come up to that flap, taking care of the needle, just to make sure that we're not getting a gap there. You just want to make sure that that is tucked around that as much as possible. And if you need your hump jumper, you can just catch your presser foot as it comes down so it doesn't jump off and skip that stitch, and then slide it out of the way. Back stitch. Then what I also like to do is just sew a second line of stitches just where that flap is. It is also basted in place, but the basting stitch is a longer, less secure stitch. What we're now going to do is fold this uppermost piece and the flap under so that we can top stitch below the flap insertion. I'm going to trim all of my threads. This particular top stitching, you cannot really open it out. There's just so much bulk there, and with the flap in the way, it's just going to be very tricky. So you're going to be folding this seam down, and I like to use double-sided tape since there is so much material there with the flap. I just put my double-sided tape right against the edge, 1/8 of an inch double-sided tape, so that it won't get caught in my top stitching. If you struggle with layers, this may be a trickier part for you. So you can use your seam roller. Some people like to use a mallet to flatten that. Just take it nice and slowly, increase your tension. If you have trouble with skip stitches when you go through a lot of layers, you can use a needle with a bigger eye, and that will help it catch the bobbin thread. Just press that down. If you're using material that you can iron, that can also help to keep that nice and flat. You can put some weight on it. And when we sew this, again, you can choose to sew from the top down and go across to keep your stitches out of the side seam where you will snip, or you can do it from the bottom. So let's go and top stitch along here. Again, keeping our hump jumper handy, taking our time and checking our tension, especially along this top part, so that we have nice even stitches. Starting at the top within the seam allowance, just sewing for about 3/8 of an inch and back stitching, pivoting. When I get past that fold, reposition my needle and my presser foot so that the inside edge of my presser foot lines up with that fold. And then I'm going to sew down here, really taking care when I get to this bump here, and I have my hump jumper here to help me if I need it. If you skip a stitch and you see it happen, it's best to pause, and if you can hand crank your needle back into the up position and slide your project back in place, you can minimize that skip stitch. Coming up to the bump, I'm just going to pop my hump jumper under the presser foot to help it stay nice and flat. Move that out of the way. Continue along. I've got my tension increased to 1.5 above the auto tension. Coming up to the other end. And then if you can see here, there's a gap beneath my presser foot. You can see the shadow there. So what I'm going to do is take my hump jumper. I'm just going to put it here underneath the presser foot to support it as it comes down off the bulk of that flap, so it doesn't hop off and skip that stitch. Slide that out of the way, continue along, and then turn again to back stitch. Trim those threads, and then we're going to take our 2 exterior pieces, our 2 interior pieces, and our stabilizer, and we are going to check to see what adjustments we need to do for the box bottom. If you recall from my Better Box Bottoms video, you will know that this angle here at the bottom is not going to give us the flat bottom that we want on our bag. So we have to adjust the angle so that it's a right angle at the side. So take your 2 exterior pieces and just do that check. You can see here that this is not a 180-degree angle. So this is not going to sit flat when the bag is done. So we need to take our ruler or a quilting square and grab your rotary cutter. And you're just going to line that up with the edge so that the flat edge of your ruler is lined up with the side seam of the bag, and you have a 90-degree angle at this corner. And this little piece here is the piece that you're just going to want to trim off. I'm just going to draw that in so you can see what I'm showing you. And I will link the Better Boxed Bottom video if you haven't seen it, so you understand in more detail why it is we're doing this. Pop that line there, just for demonstration purposes. And I'll show you, I'll do the same thing on this one. Lining up, straight line on the ruler with the corner here so that you have a 90-degree angle here which will then create a 90-degree angle on the side of your bag so that it won't bow down at the bottom. And then if you see now, when we lay these together, you will have a nice flat base of your bag, because this is the side of your bag here. It's going to be a triangular shape. So you want this to have a flat bottom rather than to have the kite shape. So we're going to correct for that, and that will now be nice and flat. But we need to do that on all of the pieces. So we have to do it on both sides of both exterior pieces, as well as the stabilizer, and also on our linings. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we can apply the stabilizer. Careful when you're cutting the lining piece that you don't cut your pocket. With all of those pieces squared up, we can go and apply our stabilizer to our exterior pieces. We apply the stabilizer before we place the socket portion of the snap on the exterior front. I am using Decaville, so mine will be centered in the middle of my exterior pieces and then fused in place. If you are using foam or fleece that is not fusible and you're going to be sewing it to the entire exterior, you can zigzag down the sides and that will help reduce the bulk. The other option is to just trim a little off the top and the bottom and sew it in place just on the sides, and that will help reduce the bulk in your upper and lower seams. So I'm going to fuse this Decaville in place, and then we will move on to placing the socket portion of a magnetic snap and then do the final assembly. If you find that your Decaville rolls up a little and you are struggling with getting it centered up, something else you can do to keep it in place is just put a little bit of painter's tape that will peel off your exterior without leaving residue. You can just put a little bit at the top and at the bottom so that you can get that properly centered up and it doesn't slide around, so that it is not in the center of your piece anymore. So that will just help keep that in place, making sure that when you fuse that, you've got a Teflon sheet between your heat source and your vinyl. The stabilizer is now in place on those exterior panels, so we can place our socket portion of our magnetic snap. Take a ruler and we're going to be marking where that socket portion is going to go. You want it centered above this bottom line. It's going to be 2 inches up from the fold. In the same way as we did the stud section, place your washer on, draw in the marks, the same marks on your stabilizer scrap if you're using one. Depending on what you have used to stabilize the exterior itself, you may not need that. Very carefully cut those holes. If you're using material that will fray, you can put some fray check on the slits too. And then we will place our socket, fold the prongs out, and cover the back with duct tape. We're now going to attach the exterior front to the exterior back. I'm going to do it in a slightly different way to the instructions. That is sewing together the bottom seam first, so that if you want to, you can add some firm stabilizer to the bottom of your bag to create a nice sturdy base. So what I'm going to do is just clip this in place, and then I'm going to sew that at 3/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to fold that bottom seam open. We are going to fuse some Decaville Heavy to the bottom, and then I will top stitch that open seam. So I'm just going to go and sew this at 3/8 of an inch, just the bottom seam. So that seam is sewn in place. And this is an optional step. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. Going to fold the exterior out. You can also do this and top stitch your bottom seam, but not add any extra stabilizer. I'm just going to fold this bottom seam out. And I'm going to use some double-sided tape to keep that in place. I've just caught a slight bit of my Decaville light. So when you're applying your stabilizer, do your best to keep it out of this bottom seam allowance. You can also trim it a little shorter if you're concerned about it. Or you can draw in your seam allowance lines on the top and the bottom to really get it in the right spot. So now that that's pressed open, I haven't top stitched it yet. I'm going to apply my Decaville Heavy first. I don't want this extra stabilizer piece to interfere with my boxed corners or where the bag folds up at the side. So I have a piece that is 2 1/4 inches tall and 8 1/4 inches wide, and I'm just going to center that up over that bottom seam. You can draw a line down the middle here if you would like to keep that nicely centered up. I'm just going to use some of my painter's tape to keep that in place so that it doesn't shift or roll on me. I'm just going to fuse that in place, and make sure when you're fusing it that you're not catching this magnet, as that could scald your vinyl. So you want to make sure that you're not including that underneath your heat press or iron. Then I'm going to sew around this, only one go, back stitching just at one end. We're now going to sew the side seams, and then we will box the bottom corners. Fold your 2 exteriors right sides together. And you're going to line up the top and the bottom, matching up the folds here. If you like, you can put some trims in the corner of those layers there. You just snip that little corner off. That will help to reduce that bulk there. I like to line the fold up, and then I will put a staple in to keep those edges nicely in line when we're sewing. Keeping that staple just within the seam allowance. You can also put a staple at the very top to keep the topmost seam lined up. And then clips along the rest of the way. You can see that my stabilizer on the bottom there is coming up a little bit. That's because I didn't let it cool properly before I continued working. You should let it cool for about 30 minutes. The other thing you can do is put some light woven or non-woven interfacing over the top, and that will help it fuse in place better too. But since it is sewn to the bottom here, it's still going to stay in place and do the job that I need it to do. So we're going to go and sew down here and here at 3/8 of an inch. Back stitching at the beginning and at the end. Pivot when you get to the point. And I just like to press down here on the fold to keep those edges well lined up. You can back stitch over the bulky part of the join, and if your machine struggles with that bulk, use your hump jumper to help you get over. Take it slow as you come back down off the layers. Keep the corners lined up. Back stitch again. Same on the other side. You want to make sure too that you have set your tension back to the correct tension for your construction as opposed to your top stitching. Trim your threads, and if you use staples, you can remove those staples, and then we are going to box our bottom corners. We're going to put our hand inside of the bag and just fold that bottom corner down, and you will see that it lines up perfectly flat because we squared up the corner there. If we had left the little piece that we cut, then this would angle out with a slight triangle on each side to make a kite shape, which would cause your bottom to bow out a little. But because we've straightened that out, we've got a perfectly flat bottom there. You can put your clips in. I like to put them just outside to hold that nice and flat. And then you can either put a clip in the center here, or you could put a staple. And I folded the side seam open so that it sits nice and flat with minimal bulk in that bottom corner. We're just going to put that in place, and then we will go and sew straight across, back stitching at the beginning and the end. Readjust if you need to get those seams lined up. Same on the other side. And we can sew both sides together. I like to back stitch over that seam in the middle just to keep it nice and opposed. And again at the end. Trim your threads and remove your staples. And then we're going to turn this out the right way. I'm turning it out through this main opening. Push your fingers down into those corners. And if you have any creases in your exterior from turning your bag out, you can press that from the inside of your bag just to smooth those out. The next thing for us to do is, if you are doing the sewn in D-ring connectors, we just need to attach those to the sides here. Take your D-ring. I'm going to open out this side seam here. Then we're just going to place it so that the rivet or the join is below where the stitch line will be. We're going to baste that in place. When we sew the lining to the exterior, we'll be sewing it at 3/8 of an inch. So you want it to be at least 3/8 of an inch from the rivet to the edge so that you're not hitting your rivet when you sew the lining in place. So center that up, and then you can clip that in place and then just do a basting stitch to keep that connector at the edge there. I'd like to have at least 1/4 of an inch overhang, but it is going to depend on where your rivet placement is. So the most that you can get without sewing through where that rivet is. Better yet, if you can have even more hanging over the edges, that will help minimize pulling on that connector once the bag is finished being sewn. But if you have done a rivet, you are going to be limited by where that rivet is placed. And as much as possible, you want to keep the tab lined straight up with the side and perpendicular to the edge so it's not twisted at all. Set that exterior aside, and we will now sew up the side seams of our lining. Take your 2 lining pieces in the same way as we did for the exterior. I'm just going to put them right sides together, but we're just going to be sewing down both sides, leaving the bottom open, as we're going to be closing the bottom of the lining through the opening in our zipper pocket. So we're just clipping straight down. These lining pieces are already cut for the pattern to be smaller than the exterior, so there is no need to grade your seam allowance for this, which is excellent. So you'll have a nice snug lining piece. So we'll just sew straight down at 3/8 of an inch. There's no need to adjust your seam allowance at all. We'll just go and sew those 2 side seams. Back stitching at the beginning and at the end. Take your interior with the side seams sewn and your completed exterior, and you're going to place the exterior inside of the interior. The bottom of the lining is still completely open, so you can just slide it over the top of your exterior. I have my lining pocket on the back. You can choose how you want to place yours. And then you're just going to tuck it inside. The exterior is slightly bigger, so you'll just have to tuck it up. And then we're going to fold the flap in also, tucked out of the way. Even pull it out the bottom to make sure that you're not going to catch it. And then you want to line up the top edge of your lining with the top edge of your exterior, matching the side seams, folding those open to reduce your bulk. I like to start lining up at the sides and then work my way around. Where there's bulk, I will put a clip on either side to keep the position where I want it. And then just easing the lining and the exterior together, making sure that the tops are as flush as you can get them. Check to make sure that your lining is not sticking up further than the exterior in any points, or that the exterior is not sticking further up. And then we're going to go and sew around the entire top of the bag at 3/8 of an inch. Because the exterior is ever so slightly larger than the interior, I'm going to place that down on my feed dogs. I have a machine that I can take the bed off, so I'll be able to slide that over the end and sew around it like this. If you're using a flat machine, then you may have to sew it the other way around. The one thing to be wary of when you're sewing with your machine without the bed is this part here. Sometimes the clips get stuck, so you want to make sure that you're getting nice even feed through and pulling off those clips if you need to, making sure that these two raw edges are lining up. I'm starting on the back section of the bag using 3/8 of an inch and my shoulder stitch length. When I get to the connectors at the side, I will take it nice and slow over the bulk. I've got my hump jumper handy. Take it nice and slow. Be careful if you have a rivet in there that you are sewing clear of the rivet, and if you have staples, be wary of your staples. The last thing you want is a broken needle that flies off and hits you in the eye. You can hand crank here if you are concerned about the bulk. As I come down off that connector, you also want to make sure that it's still straight. You can get your hand in here. It's a little snug. You can get your hand in just to make sure that that connector is being sewn on straight. I'm going to put my hump jumper here. Make sure the lining is pulled down. This is a little bit of a trickier part on a domestic machine. My stitch went crooked, so I'm just going to back stitch there. Come back forward, nice and slow. The hump jumper underneath as it comes down. Make sure it's not missing any stitches. Let it come down, and we will continue around. We're now sewing the front of the bag. Again, watching to make sure that those edges are staying nicely lined up. Coming up to the other connector now. Fold that seam along, it's open. Check that it's lined up still. Coming to the other side, I'm going to take my hump jumper again, pop it underneath to support that pressing foot so it doesn't hop off. Again, that my edges are lined up. skip a stitch there and go back. You can always go back and fix that at the end too. Continue around and we're almost back to where we started. And then we're going to back stitch. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a look at where I have sewn around the top of the bag and see if there's anywhere that the stitches are not quite even, that I would like to straighten out a bit more. You can see there that's not quite straight there. Without the clips in place and knowing that the layers are already lined up, if you do a second row of stitches at the same seam allowance, you can get a little bit more consistency in that line of stitches. We're going to trim our threads and we're going to remove any staples. And then we're going to pull that lining out. And then we're going to tuck it in so that we can top stitch around the top opening of the bag. We're going to be folding it over, tucking it in, and then place clips all around the opening of your bag. The bottom of your lining is still not closed. That is the last thing that we're going to do. Fold the flap out of the way and clipping along behind where the flap will fold over. Some of these places that have a little more bulk where those seams are and where the connectors are, you can take key fob pliers and just squeeze on that bulk, and that can help flatten that out for top stitching. Or you can use a mallet. I recommend protecting your material if you use either of those methods so that you don't damage your vinyl. And when you're happy with that, and satisfied that you can handle the bulk, we're going to go and just sew around the entire top of this bag. We're going to be starting our top stitching at the back here, taking long tails and not back stitching, and the join will be hidden under where that flap is. I'm again going to be sewing with the bed of my machine, but that's optional. You can sew this way if you need to. Sliding the bag in, starting at the back with long tails, longer stitch length, and increased tension. Using the edge of my presser foot as a guide, we're just going straight around the entire top. If when you get to the connectors you struggle, you don't have to top stitch over those. You can stop your top stitching here and start again here. If you're planning to do that, I would just start at one end and sew across the back, take long tails to tie off and tuck in, and then start again on the other side of the connector. Some domestic machines really don't do well with all of that bulk. You just want to keep that lining folded out of the way. And if you keep a nice consistent speed, you get nice even stitches in your top stitching. Coming up to this bulk, take it nice and slowly. I've got my hump jumper here, and I have pressed that down with my key fob pliers. And just watch the thread. If it loops rather than just stay taut, then you've probably missed a stitch. Hump jumper here. Common place to skip a stitch is as it comes down off the bulk. Tucking the lining under. This is the very front of the bag. I'm really going to try to keep that lining tucked down. Taking care as I come up over this connector. Hump jumper again. Continuing along. I'm going to pull these threads through And then we'll meet back up with where we started. Back where the first stitch is, take long tails. And I'm going to pull the rest of the threads through to the back, where I can tie a knot and tuck that between the layers. The last step of finishing up our Iris Crossbody is to close up the lining. So open your bag and open your lining zipper pocket. What you're then going to do is put your hand in through the pocket and pull the entire lining up and out through the pocket opening. Take your clips and we're going to close up that bottom seam, and we're going to be sewing straight across with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I line up the edges first and then flatten that out and clip the rest of the way. And then I'm going to head over to the sewing machine and sew along here, keeping that as flat and straight as possible. Backstitching at the beginning and the end, and you have your bag here, so you just need to make sure that you're holding it in place so that you get a nice straight line of stitches, as the bag is going to want to pull off the edge of your machine a little bit. Got that lining pulled up as much as I can. I'm going to trim those threads, and then I'm going to press that bottom seam open. Then we will be ready to clip it in place so that we can box the corners of our lining. Pressing the bottom seam open will help it to sit nice and flat in the bottom of your bag. You can even use some double-sided tape to stick that down if you like. Go to your corners. You're going to open them out. Open out that side seam also, and you're going to line them up so that the edge is perfectly flat. If you didn't correct the angle on your boxed corners, then you will have a little bit sticking out here from the side piece. So make sure that when you sew it, you keep this part flat, and if you have the angle pointed up, you're still going to sew straight across using the flat line of the bottom as your base, not angled. If you try to line it up like this with the side seam, then you're going to get some bowing in the bottom. You want this to be flat so that the bottom of your bag is flat. Use clips or staple. I like to put the clips on the side also, as I did for the exterior. You can put as many as you want. And then we're going to be sewing both bottom corners at 3/8 of an inch. Lining up the center seam on the bottom here and the center seam on the side there, so that you have a nice lined up corner, and it should line up here on the outside also. If you have trouble lining up your seams with the seams open, the alternative is to fold them opposite ways and then push them into each other, and that will help you get a nicely aligned seam. If you do it that way, you're going to want to make sure that your fold on the bottom goes the same way so that you don't have a twist in the base of your lining. I'm going to open mine out. The more that you pull your lining through your bag, the easier it's going to be to get those edges to line up. And then we'll go and sew both of those. Again, at 3/8 of an inch, I'm back stitching well at the beginning and at the end. And I will also do a couple of extra back stitches at the seam. Remove your clips and snip your threads, and then we're going to tuck the lining back in through that pocket, keeping the pocket lining out, as we'll need to close that up also. We're going to fold this under. I like to fold the top down first and use my fingers to tuck in the sides. Get my first crease, and then I can match the other side so that the bottom seam will line up. At the side here, you can fold it to one side or you can fold it open. And if you're concerned about the bulk in that corner, you can press that with your key fob pliers, or an iron will help too. Another little thing you can do, if you're worried again about the bulk, is just put a little snip in the corner here, taking care not to go through your threads. And then when you fold it open, you'll have a lot less bulk in this upper corner. And another way to do it would be just to put a little snip, triangle shape here, taking care not to cut through anything other than your seam allowance and not too close to your stitch line. Put that there. You can see that little bit cut out. Fold that over, and then it's a lot less bulk in that corner. And that'll just help it to sit more flat, so you have less bulk when you're closing that up. If you find that one side is bulging out more than the other side, if you sew with that side down on your feed dogs, that will help to just work that little bit of excess in so that you have a nice even pocket lining. And then we're going to go over to the sewing machine. We're going to be sewing this at 1/8 of an inch using a shorter stitch length. We're going to be closing up the entire bottom of that pocket. Back stitching, hold your tail so you don't get any nesting if your machine is prone to that. And then just sew straight along the bottom, making sure that the two folds are lined up. And then you can trim or mount or tuck in those threads. Now that that is sewn, we're going to tuck in that pocket lining. Push it right down into the bottom corners. You can use a point turner if you need to get that tucked in. Just kind of turning that seam out of the corner, poking right in. Tuck your lining properly into your bag. The corners is sitting in really nicely. The bottom of the bag is flat because we closed it through that lining pocket. See that there? Then we just need to pop on our strap. And there you have it. That is your completed Iris Mini Crossbody from A Quaint Stitch. A couple of little takeaways from this pattern. The main thing that I would do differently in the future is these D-ring tabs. With the rivets there, it was tricky to sew it, and they're not as far down as I might like. Usually on a crossbody bag, I like to have at least 1/2 inch within the bag so that it's less likely to pull out. This is sewn several times, but in the future, I think I would not secure this at all. The pattern instructions have you sew across the bottom, which you can do, but I personally don't like the look of that, which is why I went with the rivet. But what I would probably do in the future instead is sew it like on this one, where it's just not set at all, so that I can get it a lot deeper in the bag. Or alternatively, you can do the option where you rivet your connector in place. But overall, this is a really fun, easy to put together pattern. It's super cute. It's a good size for a teen or tween, or for your kids, or just for you if you just want a smaller everyday bag. And you can be really creative because of all the different pieces. You can put contrasting colors, you can do prints, you could even do one of those tiny little cut panels would work on either the front there or the flap. Probably the flap rather than here because you've got the snap there. But lots of options. You could also turn this into a slip pocket. You would just cut 2 more of the exterior back centerpiece, sew them right sides together, fold it out, top stitch along, and then you would just attach that over the top there, baste that in place, and then you would have a slip pocket sewn closed at the bottom when you attach this bit. It would be a little bulky at the sides, but I think it would be okay depending on your materials of choice. So that would be another really fun option to just add an extra little pocket to this bag. I may do a little add-on video in the future next time I'm making one of these. Hope that helps. Thanks, everyone.